Hello, in the last video I went over briefly about the path that the female and male gametes take after leaving the gonads. So here we're going to fill in a few more details and pay a little more attention to the uterus here. Now first, real quick, we're going to talk about the path of sperm from the testes. Again, it's made in the seminiferous tubules of the testes and is passed prior to maturation to the structure external to the testes, the epididymis. So sperm is going to mature here, and if it's not ejaculated, it will be reabsorbed here. From the epididymis, sperm is going to move through the vas deferens or ductus deferens, which travels within the spermatic cord through the inguinal canal into the pelvic cavity. Once again, this whole movement is occurring through ciliated sweeping and peristaltic movements. The sperm is not active yet. The vas deferens is easily accessible for the surgical procedure, the vasectomy, in which the tubes are cut and tied, and hence no sperm can make it up further up the tract and cause any trouble. Note here that sperm is still being produced in the testes. It will just be continuously reabsorbed, and the procedure can be reversed. So moving up through the vas deferens, it will travel around the back of the bladder until it gets to a region called the ejaculatory duct. And at this point, it's going to be met with several secretions from those three glands we talked about, which together is going to make up the semen. So note that even with a vasectomy, the secretions will still occur in the ejaculate. There will just be no sperm. So the details of these secretions are covered in the last video. But note here, once the sperm travels past the ejaculatory duct, it's going to share the same pathway as urine through the prostatic, membranous, and then the spongy urethra before exiting out the external urethral orifice. Also, note here the prostate gland is very susceptible to cancer, and tumor growth here will block the urethra and hence the urine flow. So this is the second highest type of cancer rate in men, which is why the prostate exam and early treatment is highly recommended. Treatment might involve inserting a small piece of radioactive material within the prostate to kill off the cancer cells. And that's how they do it, so have fun getting old. So that's it for the male reproductive tract for now. We're going to switch back to the female reproductive tract once the oocyte bursts out of the ovary. But while we're discussing cancer, and as we move on to the female reproductive tract, I also want to mention ovarian cancer. So remember that the female gamete is going to rupture through the ovarian wall during ovulation. So the tunica albuginea and the germinal layer must proliferate and repair itself every time after ovulation. The population involved in ovarian cancer are these germinal epithelia, or the visceral peritoneum. This is in contrast to testicular cancer, where the actual cancerous cells are the sperm cells themselves. So once the oocyte leaves the ovary, it's going to be collected by the fimbriae on the infundibulum of the uterine tubes. So it's worth pointing out again that the uterine tubes have little or no direct contact with the ovaries themselves. This is in contrast to the male reproductive ducts, which are directly continuous with the tubules of the testes. Instead, each ovulated oocyte is going to be released into the peritoneal cavity, and the uterine tube has to perform a complex series of movements to capture that oocyte. So this is also relevant when we talk about endometriosis. But hopefully the oocyte moves into the uterine tube by the fimbriae and the infundibulum. Just proximal to the infundibulum is the ampulla region, which would be the site of fertilization were that to occur. And whether fertilized or not, the egg is going to move through the uterine tubes toward the uterus through ciliary currents and peristaltic contraction, similar to sperm prior to being activated. From there, the egg is going to enter the cavity of the uterus, and if infertilized, is going to implant within the uterine wall. Last, the uterine tube is the site of 90% of all ectopic pregnancies, where the fertilized gamete does not move down the tube into the uterine cavity. and begins to develop within the fallopian tube itself. But again, the normal place for the embryo to implant is within the uterine wall. So just to recap, the female egg, the oocyte, leaves the ovary during ovulation, is captured by the uterine tube, where it may or may not be fertilized in the ampulla region. Either way, it's going to move down the uterine tubes into the uterus and implant in the wall if fertilized. In that case, the uterus becomes the location for development of that embryo and fetus. So the uterus is sitting within the pelvic cavity, anterior to the rectum and superior and a little posterior to the bladder, although there's some variation in the actual tilt of the uterus in this region. Within the uterus, there's a few regions to know. The most anterior is the fundus, which is near the fallopian tubes. And the major portion of the uterus is called the body, and slightly below the body is the isthmus, which is going to lead to the cervix, which is the inferior tip which projects into the vagina. The cervix is highly susceptible to cancer for reasons I'm not going to get into, although feel free to ask me about it if you're curious. Cervical cancer can be detected early by the pap smear or cervical smear test. Here, some of the epithelial cells are scraped off and examined for abnormalities. Since the cervical cancer is sexually transmitted and caused by the human papillomavirus, it can be largely prevented by vaccinations. So back to the uterine wall. I mentioned the layers of the uterus in the last video, but I want to look at the most inner wall, the endometrium, in more detail. The endometrium is lined by a simple columnar epithelial overlying an epithelial glandular tissue divided into two sublayers. The stable basilar layer adjacent to the myometrium and the more dynamic functional layer facing the uterine cavity. So in a regular cycle driven by hormones, this functional layer breaks down and is shed from the uterus and then is rebuilt back to its previous thickness through proliferation of the epithelia. So this epithelia tissue is designed like that to undergo extensive mitosis under the influence of estrogen. And this tendency to proliferate, along with the anatomy of the reproductive tract, is going to help explain the disease endometriosis. In endometriosis, some of the cells of the endometrium migrate up through the fallopian tubes. And because the fallopian tubes open up into the pelvic cavity and aren't directly attached to the ovaries, the endometrial tissue can escape into the abdominal pelvic cavity. There, they can still respond to hormone signals and proliferate as if they were in the uterine wall. So endometriosis is not a malignant growth. The cells are just doing what they are supposed to do, just in the wrong place. The growth in the surrounding tissue can cause an immune response and resulting painful inflammation. So the whole function of the endometrium and the uterus in general is to receive the fertilized egg and provide a spot for nourishment and growth for it. So during the secretory phase here, the wall waits, hopefully, for implantation of the egg, regardless of what the person attached to that uterus might be hoping for. So the endometrial wall patiently waits and waits, but after a certain period, it begins to wonder what is going on when no egg implants. And then at some point, it begins to realize that there is no fertilized egg again. This makes the endometrial layer very sad and angry, and it wonders why it even bothers. Again, this is from the perspective of the uterus and does not necessarily reflect the feelings of the person attached to that uterus. But it tears itself down and the entire functional layer is shed out from the uterus. After a cooling down period, it regains hope that, well, maybe next month a fertilized egg will come and begins to rebuild itself in preparation. So this whole process of preparing for implantation and rebuilding after shedding is known as the uterine cycle or menstrual cycle and is driven by estrogen and progesterone derived from the ovary. And these hormones are secreted by ovarian structures, which are themselves regulated by hormones derived from the pituitary gland, regulated by the hypothalamus. So these two cycles, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, are tightly linked, where the release of estrogen and progesterone from the ovary into the general bloodstream has more widespread effects than just the uterine cycle. During puberty, this drives the secondary sex characteristics and, like many hormones, can affect moods. This is true for both estrogen, progesterone, as well as testosterone in males. So estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone play a much larger role outside the direct reproductive function, although some of the behavior that the hormones influence is related to the reproductive cycle. So here's a good example. When a cat gets spayed, this usually consists of an ovariohysterectomy, which means that both the ovaries and the uterus, along with the uterine tubes, are removed from the cat to ensure that it does not get pregnant. However, it is possible to remove just the uterus from a cat and leave the ovaries intact. So my 12-year-old cat, which had a hysterectomy only, still goes into cycles of heat, but cannot get pregnant. So the uterus, as part of that female reproductive tract, and the cervical canal leads into the fornix region of the vagina. I had previously mentioned how a guy passing kidney stones might be equivalent to giving birth, but I'm going to take that back now. The vagina is going to act as the birth canal during labor and must be highly elastic and dispensable for this, as well as its other role prior to that. And so, like so many tubular structures we studied, there's usual multiple tissue layers. The mucosal lining is a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial, and so can withstand friction and resist bacterial infection. In this case, estrogen is going to promote the storage of glycogen in the epithelial cells. And like any epithelial layer, the lining is continuously exfoliating, and the released glycogen is metabolized into lactic acid by beneficial resident bacteria, lowering the pH of the lumen and inhibiting the growth of pathogens. And the low pH also inhibits sperm, and that's another reason for the alkaline secretions found in semen. So an epithelial, as always, is going to be underlaid by a lamina propria, and in this case the lamina propria has a lot of elastic fibers. And so this mucosal membrane is also marked by rugae, that is those transverse fold that allow expansion. And the surrounding smooth muscle is also going to contain a lot of elastic fibers, as does the fibrous tissue making up the adventitia. So the vaginal orifice opens up into the female vestibule, and so at this point we left the reproductive tract proper with their internal structures onto the final category, at which point you're grateful not to be studying in a public space.